vigilance, but also with different partners. Today, this seminar is co-sponsored by the School of Humanities, the Center for Comparative and Public Law, and HKU Vigilance. And I will also, though Carole Petersen visit to Hong Kong this time, has also been supported by two other entities of the university, one the Women's Studies Research Center, and also the Arts Faculty Gender Task Force, for which Carole spoke this evening here. So thank you to all of those groups for coming together and making this possible. At HKU Vigilance, when we started thinking about having seminars and so on, discussing issues around governance, the first name that was top of our list that we must have to visit us was Carole Petersen, because she literally wrote the book, or co-wrote the book on academic freedom in Hong Kong. She has a copy of it theoretically, which was done.
We're trying to update it now.
A few things have happened since 2006. It was 2006, right?
Yes, 10 years.
10 years ago. So yes, lots of updates, lots of things have been happening. We're very happy to have Carole here speaking to us today. Carole, as probably most of you know, used to teach in the law faculty at Hong Kong U. She taught there from 1998 to 2006, is that right? Something like that. She's now at the University of Hawaii. She's going to talk to us today. The title of her talk is University Governance, Academic Freedom, and the Need for Negotiated Reforms. We're very happy also to have as a respondent Professor Joseph Chan, who probably also doesn't really need an introduction. He's Professor of Political Philosophy here at Hong Kong U, is a member of Hong Kong U Council, and is one of the founding members of HKU Vigilance also, so it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. So we're going to have about 35 minutes from Carole, about 10 minutes from Joseph, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion. I realize that several people sitting on this side of the room will be running off
to teach, yeah.
To teach, or whatever it is, other stuff we do at this university. So let's start. Carole, on University Governance, Academic Freedom, and the Need for Negotiated Reforms.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Timothy, and everyone who's helped to organize this event today. I should add that before I taught in law faculty, I was in the law unit at the School of Professional and Continuing Education, Hong Kong U Space, and before that, I was at City University. I actually taught for a total of 17 years in Hong Kong, and because I was in 3 different entities, I have a little bit of comparative experience on different units. And so that has, I think, enriched somewhat my understanding of academic freedom and the importance of certain structures in protecting it. I want to say by way of introduction, in addition to teaching at the law school at the University of Hawaii, I also am director of this Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, which means I have a joint appointment in the College of Social Sciences and the law school. And it has changed my perspective on some issues because I was always a litigator. I mean, before I became an academic, I was a litigator, and my approach to things was always make the best argument and hope that that judge will go your way. Since I have been head of this conflict resolution program, my perspective has changed somewhat. I mean, the reason they asked me to head up the conflict resolution program is I did a lot of research on mediation of sex discrimination and other discrimination complaints in Hong Kong and the EOC. So they thought, well, she has a perspective on mediation. But truthfully, before I got to Hawaii, my perspective on mediation was often a critique of mediation, because I feel very strongly that in some situations of power imbalance, it's not necessarily so good. But having now been head of a conflict resolution program, I have a lot more experience in seeing how mediation and also effective facilitation skills can help to bring people together when there are very complex disputes. And that is some of the approach that I'm going to try to take today, because as Michael Davis and I were having a little bit of a debate at lunch, and one of the things I kept saying is, yes, but you have to remember, we don't get to always take our disputes to a neutral judge who gets to decide, you made the best argument, you made the best argument. Very often you're in a situation where the other side actually does have the power. And so your role, if you want to, or your best strategy, I should say, if you want to bring about change, is not just to make an argument about why you're right, but to make an argument that shows the other side the common interest in making a change. In other words, getting the other side to see that our current situation is problematic, not just for us, but also for the institution, the University of Hong Kong, and in my opinion, for the Hong Kong government as well. I don't think the current situation with the chief executive being the chancellor of all the universities and appointing everyone, or so many people to council, works for the Hong Kong government. I think it actually creates unrealistic expectations that somehow the Hong Kong government can control what happens at universities, which of course it cannot. You can't control students, you can't control what faculty write. And it would be, I think, better, not just for all of you, and not just for the academic community of Hong Kong, but actually better for the Hong Kong government if there were reforms to the structure of universities. Now that being said, there's a lot of different directions that those reforms could go. And so part of what I'm going to try to do today is to introduce a little bit of comparative experience, because threats to academic freedom are not just confined to Hong Kong, and they're not just confined to places where you have a government like Beijing looming to the north. We have threats to academic freedom in the United States all the time. Sometimes it's from corporate influence. Sometimes we have political disputes. Sometimes we have disputes about when should the rules on sexual harassment or the prohibition on racial harassment interfere with what you say and do as a professor at university. So there are debates swirling around all over the world about academic freedom, and there are different approaches that can be taken. So I'm hoping to bring in both a conflict resolution perspective on the problem that I see today, and also some comparative perspective. So with that, we have to acknowledge, of course, that right now it's a really bad time in Hong Kong. It's the lowest time that I can imagine since I arrived in Hong Kong in 1989. Since I arrived here shortly after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and that was a really, really bad time, and then things got somewhat better, and now I think we're back at a really, really low time. In terms of academic freedom, up until recently, I would have said that the incident with Johannes Chan's appointment not being confirmed by council was one of the most eye-catching threats to academic freedom since the Robert Chung affair. Now I would have to change that because I think the disappearance of the booksellers has surpassed anything that has happened before. Because even though the disappearance of the booksellers isn't directly related to academic freedom, I realized that the books that they were selling were kind of more the National Enquirer, version. They were not exactly an academic publication. But the fact is, they disappeared from Hong Kong. And I don't know anybody who believes that they wandered across the border on their own, right? I don't know anyone who believes that in Hong Kong. Even people who might normally side with the government, they don't believe it. And what's equally frightening, maybe even more frightening, is I don't think the central government expects you to believe it or wants you to believe that story. I actually think the central government, whether it organized this or not, I realize there's a debate about whether the central government approved it or was surprised when it happened, but I think regardless of whether the central government approved it in advance, I think the central government is taking advantage now of the fear that it has created. It's a game changer in many respects, and it's without doubt the most egregious violation of the one country, two systems principle, of the basic law that has happened so far, and the chilling effect could be enormous. So that's why I say we're at a really, really bad time right now. In that respect, there is a need for positive affirmative action and a united action. And this is what I mean when I say it's in everyone's interest to make this situation better. The reputation of Hong Kong U and other universities in Hong Kong has plummeted in the past couple of years. I've given a number of talks I've given talks in Hawaii, I've given talks in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations. everybody is paying attention to Hong Kong. In one sense, that might be good. International attention is good. But unless something is done to reassure people that the universities in Hong Kong really are safe from interference and that freedom of expression really is protected in Hong Kong, you're going to see a real decline in the ability of universities to recruit students and to recruit faculty. I have already had conversations with law students in the United States who had considered coming here to do an LLM, and they're not going to come anymore. Sometimes I think their concerns are maybe exaggerated. It's kind of like the year after SARS when people said, oh, my parents won't let me go to Hong Kong anymore. Said, really, I think it's safe to go to Hong Kong. So, some of their concerns might be exaggerated, but the fact is, that's the view of universities in Hong Kong that's starting to spread, that things are no longer safe. I had a lot of conversations with a particular academic who'd been made an offer from a university in Hong Kong who really was struggling with whether or not to accept the offer. And this person was really interested, had really wanted to come. But after the incidents of this year, this person just wasn't so sure that they wanted to make that decision and make that move to Hong Kong. So it's in everyone's interest, certainly in the university and anyone on council who cares about the reputation of the university, to try to do something to improve the situation. As I mentioned before, I think it's also in the interest of the government. The concept that the chief executive should be chancellor of all these universities was always a bad concept. It should have been changed before the handover, well before the handover. It was one thing when the governor sort of had this ceremonial power, and I'm not saying that the government never exercised influence, I'm sure they did at times, but it's clear that since the handover, that the chief executives have used this power more aggressively. And it's got to be fixed, not only for the health of the universities, but because it creates this expectation that somehow the government can influence the universities. I mean, the job of chief executive is already an impossible job. Who would want to also be responsible for what happens at the universities? It would be better for the government if we could move in a direction of more autonomy. And before I go into some of the background of what I want to say, I do want to suggest that everyone, if they get a chance, read the Newby Report, the most recent report issued by the University Grants Committee on Governance and UGC-funded higher education institutions in Hong Kong. It was written in September 2015, but it was just released on the UGC's website in March. And take a look at page 20 especially, because the Newby Report recognizes that the current situation where universities have little or no control over the external members of their council is a very bad situation. And it leads to a situation where they feel a need to cozy up, essentially. They don't use that language, but to get too close to the chief executive. And the Newby Report also recognizes that it often leads to the appointment of people on council who really don't have the skills or interest or time to devote themselves to the business of council. And so this UGC report, I think, could be very useful because it is, I think, a neutral perspective that recognizes that it's in the interest of the universities to develop different procedures for appointing who is on council. Now, I want to go back now a little bit into history because I actually started researching academic freedom way back in 1996. And I did so because I was teaching constitutional law, and I was fascinated by the fact that the Hong Kong Basic Law and the Joint Declaration have unusually detailed provisions for both academic freedom and educational autonomy. And of course, we know why they were put there. They were put there because people were nervous, and representatives on the Basic Law Drafting Committee wanted something very specific. And I was kind of fascinated because I think if you do comparative constitutional law, it's really hard to find a constitution elsewhere in the world that has such detailed protection for both individual academic freedom and the autonomy of educational institutions. including not only higher education, but also schools, right? Including religious schools, right? But the question that I started thinking about in 1996 was, yeah, but how do you enforce these? Because usually, if someone's academic freedom is challenged, it's going to be threatened in some way that makes it difficult to pin, right? To identify the attack as being based on a violation of academic freedom. Moreover, if at the time in 1996, vast majority of academics did not have tenure. They were for the most part on renewable contracts, which made it really dangerous to make any kind of complaint. Even if someone did have the guts to go to court and complain, there's the cost rules. The way it works in Hong Kong is that if you sue your university and you lose, you could be hit with a cost order. And if you've been here a really long time, you might remember the Jill Spruce case. She was a barrister who worked in the law faculty who was substantiated, that was the term for tenure then. She was let go allegedly because she violated the outside practice rules. She may have done so, I have no idea. But what I found most interesting about the case was that she brought an action for judicial review. She lost in the High Court. She won in the Court of Appeal. She didn't get quite the remedy she wanted, but she got a judgment that the contract had been violated by her dismissal. It's kind of summarizing it for you. There was an appeal that went up to the Privy Council, which was the highest court of appeal at that time. She lost. Privy Council level, and on top of that, the Privy Council issued an order that she paid the University of Hong Kong's costs at all three levels: High Court, Court of Appeal, and Privy Council. You know what that legal bill was? She disappeared. She just left. I have no idea where she went, but she did not stick around because there was no way she would have been bankrupted by those fees. Now that's something that got me thinking as early as 1996. What are all these provisions in the basic law on academic freedom worth if you are too vulnerable to bring any kind of legal action to enforce it? So that's what I mean about institutions of autonomy. That was the part of the title of my first article on academic freedom in Hong Kong, which I published, I think, in 1998. Which is how do you build institutions that provide protection? It's essential that the protection be built into the university structure, because if an individual has to go to court to enforce their rights, it's going to take a very brave and potentially very rich individual to be able to do that. The other concern that I had early on was, we all know there was a lot of pressure on university leaders as the transition was coming in 1997 to build good relationships with Chinese universities, right? And I can remember sitting at one point in my first academic job at City University, and my department head then was Derek Roebuck, a British man. Very traditional, in some ways perhaps a little naive though, about what was coming, because there was an opportunity for us to start some sort of, I can't remember the exact name, but some sort of research center in our new law department at City University on mainland Chinese law, and people were giving presentations and kind of excited about it. And this was the first time I raised my hand in a meeting and said, what about academic freedom? Because all this money was coming from China. And I still remember Derek Roebuck looking at me and kind of laughing and saying, well, what do you mean? I mean, this is Hong Kong. You can write whatever you want. You can research whatever you want. And then he turned to the person who I will not name at this meeting, who was giving the presentation, and he said, right? And the person said, well, yeah, except for, the obvious things. And I said, the obvious things? He said, well, yeah, obviously you're not going to write about human rights in China or something like that. And then I still remember Derek's mouth kind of opening, and suddenly the penny dropped that actually there might be some strings tied to this money that could potentially come in. And that's one of the reasons I actually looked to leave City University, is that I felt the way City University was organized was not protective enough of academic freedom. And it may be different now. This was 1990. But I just felt there was a very top-down kind of management style there and structure there, and there was perhaps not the institutional history that was necessary to really defend an academic if that person was engaging in research, as I knew I was likely to do, that might displease government, either here or in China. When I moved over to the University of Hong Kong first, I was at Space. I moved here initially in 1991, and then I remember in 1996, the former chancellor of City University, or president of City University, Patrick Chung, became chancellor here. And I do remember thinking, uh-oh, what's happening, what's coming? This could be a very different management style than former chancellors. And I think it was, right from the start. And very early, before the Robert Chung affair occurred in 2000, a proposal to reorganize the university was circulated, and some of you might remember it. And it was going to reorganize this university into big schools. And I remember even the law faculty was going to suddenly be in a big school with the business department of economics, I think. And I can remember going to a presentation on it. My husband and I, my husband was also a law professor at the time, and looked at each other, and I put up my hand and I said, what about academic freedom? Because in the proposal, it was getting rid of elected deans, much bigger schools, and I found myself thinking, you know, I feel quite safe in my little law unit in Space where I was at the time, and my husband felt quite safe in the law faculty, but I wasn't sure that any of us would feel safe in a great big school with suddenly an appointed head and no elected dean anymore. And once again, the person who was giving the presentation laughed. He said, academic freedom? There's never been any threat to academic freedom in Hong Kong. That's silly. What are you talking about? I mean, he really openly laughed. And I didn't actually get many other people to show any interest. And that proposal was kind of hanging out there to reorganize us into schools when Robert Chung published his article in the South China Morning Post. And for the first time, people didn't laugh when I said, what about academic freedom? For the first time, we actually had someone who was willing to say, yes, I feel vulnerable. And I don't want to go through the details of the Robert Chung affair, because I'm sure most of you are very well acquainted with it. It's a whole chapter in this book if you want to read about it. But one of the important things about the Robert Chung affair is that there was a dispute of fact. You might remember Robert Chung alleged something, and the vice chancellor, former Boston City University, Patrick Chung, immediately denied it. He said, absolutely not. I did not interfere with anyone's academic freedom. It created a dispute of fact, and that independent investigation panel did its investigation, and it was very transparent. Some of you who are here might remember their hearings were televised, which was very important in my opinion. And Robert Chung testified, came across, I think, very sort of innocent and open, and our former vice chancellor didn't come across all that well. I mean, he had a lot of legal representation, so did the special assistant from Tang Chihuahua's office had a lot of legal representation, and it was pretty easy, I think, for the public to sit and watch those televised hearings and draw some conclusions. But it was transparent. And that's one of the things that I want you to think about in terms of what happened more recently with Johannes Chan and also with Benny Tai. You know, how transparent was the investigation and the analysis of what was going into the decision-making process. Some of you might remember that 41 chair professors wrote a letter defending the vice chancellor and saying they didn't think anything that he had done was wrong. But over 400 ordinary academics, including a lot of deans, elected deans and department heads, signed a petition. Not asking for his resignation. All that petition did was to ask the university council to adopt the report of the independent investigation panel. In other words, they've done their job, they've investigated the facts, they've given you a report. Now you, as the policy-making body, decide what you're going to do with that report. And when the council resumed to hear, to look at that report and decide what to do, shortly before they had to reach any kind of decision, the vice chancellor resigned. as did the pro-vice chancellor, who had been the messenger, who had conveyed the message to Robert Chung. Of course, their resignation sort of saved the council from having to make a real decision. And on one hand, a lot of people would say the Robert Chung affair was a big triumph for academic freedom. I felt a little less reassured, though, because the council never did make any decision on it. And one of the reasons I think they didn't is we have this very messy connection. Chung Shih-hua was our chancellor. Right? This was a complaint about an interference with academic freedom, which had originated in his office. On top of that, the chair of council, or this T.L. Yang was, I can't remember if he was a member, chair, I think he was the chair of council, T.L. Yang. He was actually a member of Chung Shih-hua's executive council. He was essentially on the guy's cabinet. I mean, all these messy connections prevented, even then, the council from really fulfilling its obligation, which was to review that report, and if you believed that the panel that you appointed, which had done a very careful investigation, and by the way, adopted the criminal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So, I mean, that was a very careful investigation, and yet that council did not, at the end, really want to touch that report because of the influence, the connection to government. Now, what I found most sad is that now that people knew that it wasn't a laughing matter to say, what about academic freedom? You would have expected maybe some navel-gazing, some thought process about the structure and where we were going. But it really did not stop the march toward an increasingly centralized university. And on this, I largely blame the Sutherland Report and the Fit for Purpose review. Those reviews, the Sutherland Report being a UGC commissioned review, did not take into account the special circumstances in Hong Kong. They simply said, oh, yeah, elected deans, that's so quaint. You're never going to be a world-class university with elected deans. You need powerful executive appointed deans who are going to manage all this money and do a very professional job. A lot of us felt that that wasn't such a great idea in light of what we had seen with the Robert Chung affair. But most people here did not argue against the centralization. And I have to say, even Johannes Chan supported it. He was our last elected dean. He was also our first appointed dean. And he was a very powerful dean who enjoyed, I think, the power that being an appointed dean gave you. And when I interviewed Johannes last fall and said, do you have any regrets about supporting that? I don't think Johannes sees that as the mistake. His feeling was, it worked fine when we had a council chair, Victor Fong, who I got along with and saw eye to eye with. It was a very good thing. Not so good now when we have a chair of council. But that's my point. You cannot have a structure that depends on having people in power who you like and who share your views. You need to have a structure that will protect the independence of the university, regardless of who is sitting in a particular chair. That's the point of structures of governance, right? So, this leads me to my title of the need for negotiated reforms. We don't have a neutral judge who we can go to and make our plea and say, please change it. We have to negotiate, or you have to negotiate, you guys are in the hot seat, somehow with government, have to persuade government that this isn't working for them either. It's not working for Hong Kong because the reputation of the universities of Hong Kong is going downhill and will continue to go downhill unless something is done to reassure the public and the international community that academic freedom is once again protected. Now, that being said, the university does have, in my opinion, a legitimate interest in knowing that there will be peaceful advocacy. I think it's very important that students' organizations have to make it very clear that they will not support anything that's violent on campus. I also think the university has a legitimate interest in being viewed as an institution as politically neutral. So for some of us, especially if you're a law academic or public policy or social work or government, it's very hard sometimes to separate your academic publications from your personal political activities. But you do have to try. You do have to make it clear when you're out there, whether it's working for a political party or in some cases running for the legislative council, as many academics in Hong Kong do, that you are not representing the university and you have to avoid conflicts of interest. And the university does also have a legitimate interest in knowing that its resources are accountable for. So, you know, the people of Hong Kong, the taxpayers of Hong Kong, don't pay us to engage 24 hours a day in politics. That's fair. I mean, our main duties are, if we're appointed here, are to teach and publish and do administration. Our personal political activities are protected by the basic law, right? Just like every other person has the right to engage in politics and freedom of expression, but we're not necessarily permitted to use our offices or our resources, right, to engage in politics. That's something I think most academics understand. It's not always easy to draw the line, but I think we need to be able to do that. Along that route, I want to tell you some comparative examples. I know I'm a little short on time, so we can do more of it in discussion, but for example, at the University of Hawaii, I am not allowed to run for the state legislature without taking leave. I have to take leave of absence. And if I win, I have to resign. Now, there's a reason why we have that rule. I don't think you necessarily need it here. We don't have a UGC in Hawaii. We are directly funded as a state university by the state legislature. And I think the University of Hawaii feels it would be too much of a conflict of interest to have, you know, a law professor sitting on the state legislature voting on the university's budget. That probably wouldn't work. They need that buffer. But it's controversial, that rule, and there's actually a bill pending right now in the Hawaii State Legislature to amend that rule because they think it is too much of a curtailment of an academic's right to engage in politics. These are the kinds of debates that are circulating all over the world. What my proposal is that it would be a good idea for academics and students to take the initiative and draft some guidelines. Don't wait for the administrators to do it. Think yourself, do some comparative research. How do we propose to, or I should say you, because I'm no longer a member of the university here, how do you propose to monitor yourselves, to govern yourselves in terms of, on one hand, exercising your right to freedom of expression, to academic publication, to your own personal political views, to get involved in politics, as everyone has the right to do, but yet protecting the university's legitimate interess in accounting for its resources, and also as an institution not being identified with one particular political party or one particular view. And there are academics at all over the political spectrum. It's not just pro-democracy. I mean, there was an associate professor from City University Law Faculty who's in LegCo and seems to have a very active political career. I don't know how she manages it. But, so it's all over. And when I looked at the bios of the current members of the Legislative Council, there are a lot of academics from a lot of different universities, some part-time, some full-time. And I think, I'm not saying it should be prohibited by any means, because you don't have to adopt the University of Hawaii rule, but it's worthwhile to start thinking about how do you account for time, how do you separate and make sure that you're not creating conflicts of interest for the university. I think if it's possible that if academics showed good faith in proposing some guidelines along those lines, it could perhaps be part of a negotiated package to advocate for reforms along the lines of abolishing the situation where the chief executive is chancellor of all the universities, which is absurd, changing the makeup of council so that it resembles, at least a little more closely, the council that we had during the Robert Chung affair. In those days, my recollection is every elected dean sat on council. It was a very, very different council. And also reading very carefully what's in the latest UGC report on governance, the Newby Report, and thinking about what should the criteria be for sitting on council? Right? What sort of expertise do you need on council? It should not be just a political plum or just something that is given to allies of the government or the chief executive. These are world-class universities. You want them to be world-class universities. They need members of council who have real expertise and have the time to devote to governance of the university. I think that's most of what I wanted to say, and I think I'm probably just about out of time. I do want to tell you, just before I turn over to Joseph Chan, that we are updating this research. I have a lot of cards here. In addition to speaking with you, I'm also happy to receive information from you. I mean, I am collecting and doing confidential interviews, and if anyone feels uncomfortable about emailing, if you feel your email is being hacked, feel free to mail it to me by snail mail. But I am interested in finding out whether people do feel that their academic freedom is threatened, and please don't hesitate to contact me if you have anything that you would like to share with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carole. So we'll hear from Joseph now. And then we'll,
Thank you. I basically agree everything Carole said. I think what she suggested is very sensible. I think she suggested that we should look carefully at the forthcoming reform, and our approach should be rational, and we should do our best to take the initiative to draft something, and we should also promote a culture of dialogue and respect on equal footing, and perhaps with mutual respect. And I mean, I think this is a very good timing to talk about this, because I foresee that the coming council meeting next week, it's next week, isn't it, will discuss the setting up of a review panel on Hong Kong youth governance. And you may have seen from news report that our council chairman apparently has been in touch with some potential candidates of the members of the review panel, and he even told the media that he hopes the whole process of review will be done within 6 months at the end of this year. And of course, nothing of this kind has been put forward to the council meeting, and we have not seen any names, and we have not even discussed that. So first of all, I think some of us have not been very happy with the way the council chairman has been doing. He has been taking things now into his own hands. But we do look forward to discussing these issues rigorously in the coming meeting. We do, me, for example, do very much want to set up the panel as soon as possible. And in light of what we have done in the past, we want the panel to be able to review comprehensively our governance structure, including even the role of the CE as our councillor, as our chancellor. In terms of institutional reform, Carole touched on a few things. She also mentioned something she didn't really speak about in the presentation, but she touches upon in her paper. I agree that the CE should not continue to serve as Chancellor of Hong Kong University or other local universities. In the past, although former chancellors of Hong Kong U have played their roles in a more ceremonial capacity, but in fact, if you look at our ordinance and statutes, our chancellor really has a lot of powers, real powers, not ceremonial powers. Our chancellor can appoint the pro-chancellor. He has to approve all recommendations for changes in our statute and ordinance, and he can appoint 7 council members, including the council chairman. And he chairs the court meetings, and he also determines when and how congregation will take place. So he has a great deal of powers, and he also, of course, has to approve all the recommendations for the appointment of honorary degrees. So I don't think we should really give the CE that so much power. Either we make Chancellor really a real nominal or ceremonial head without giving him any powers, or if the Chancellor does have powers, then we should really make sure that the Chancellor is not the chief executive of the government. And Carole in her paper interestingly mentioned, and he's also in her presentation, mentioned a little bit about the idea of returning to the elected dean system. And she thinks that the appointed dean system, is perhaps one potential source of problems for academic freedom and accountability. I'm not so sure about this because I as a political scientist, I see every kind of institution has pros and cons. If you have an elected system, then you will tend to have a weak dean, and the dean will be torn between various politics between departments, and may not be able to do things in an effective way. So there are pros and cons. But she mentioned that even if we retain the appointment system, then we should try to make sure that in the search for the dean, in the appointment of deanship, faculty should be well represented on the committee. And I think this is absolutely important. And in our current latest system, the appointment of dean is to be conducted by a committee, a search committee. And the search committee comprises several kinds of people. The VC, and then he appoints 2 SMT members to the search committee, one academic, one non-academic. So you may count altogether the SMT has 3 representatives on the committee. And then there's a layman of the council sitting on the committee. And then the council, and then the faculty board chairman is an ex-official member. And then 2 elected teachers from the faculty, and 1 student. So you have 3 teachers representatives, so to speak, 3 SMTs, 1 student, and 1 council lay member. And so I sat on the previous search committee for our faculty dean, and I remember we had 3 teachers. Now we have 2 elected teachers. In the past we had 3 elected teachers. I think the number of elected teachers has gone down a little bit. That's not so good. And but at least there are some, these elected teachers have formal voting rights. They cannot simply to be consulted, but they can vote on the selection of the dean. And in the last search of our faculty dean, I also remember that although the president or the vice chancellor presided over the committee, and also he was assisted by the deputy vice chancellor, the 2 of them didn't really vote. Only the elected teachers and the student voted. And I think that was good too. But I don't know now, this time things may have changed, and the VC may want to take a more proactive vote and actually exercises his power. And talking about representation of deans in the council, you said that in the past, all the deans were represented, right? They were members, voting members on the council. And you suggested perhaps we should also revert back to the old system. I agree that we should increase the representation of the deans in the council. But if you want all 10 deans to go back to the council, it will make the council much bigger. And I can see pros and cons of having a really big council. It will slow down discussion. There will be a lot of sort of problems arising from big size. Maybe one way to go about this is to bring back some of the deans to the council. I.e., we let the 10 deans to select or elect a representative, a few of them, to sit on the council so that they can have a formal voice. Currently, the deans are only invited to sit, to be, auditing the committee, the council meetings. And on restricted items, they have to leave too. And I think that is not satisfactory. I think we do want to bring the voices of deans back to council. And also, the Newby Report mentioned about the role of council members, especially lay members, external members. I agree that we need to improve the selection of council members. Right now, I've not seen any documents of our university laying out the principles for selecting or appointing council members. What are the characteristics or qualifications that we would look for? And maybe at a certain particular time, we need council members having certain expertise, because we lack those expertise to assist our development. And in that case, we should really put it on paper and say, this is kind of people we want. But as far as I know, the appointment of the council, at least the external councils, are really, a black box. And I don't know how these names were appointed or recommended and how they were appointed. And even when a new member is appointed, that member is never really educated somehow. I as a newly elected member have not been instructed about previous meetings. I still know very little about what happens to our Centennial hospital, for example, a very sensitive and politically important issue. And so there's no induction of new council members. And there's no even introduction of new members to council. When a new member appears for the first time on the council, he or she is not introduced. We don't know who he is except his name. Where he's come from, what is his work experience, we don't know. And so it's a very strange system. So I do agree with one point made in the Newby Report, that we should improve the system of selecting and inducting our new council members. And finally, I just want to say that perhaps the vigilance group, should take up Carole's suggestion that we should maybe draft something in consultation with colleagues here and elsewhere about our views or opinions about university reform. And but no matter what, institutional reform is extremely difficult. If you put it in the larger political context, we will see that it's extremely difficult to get rid of the CE as our chancellor. And the whole saga of the appointment of Johannes Chen has taken place in a political atmosphere. It is the aftermath of the umbrella movement. So I foresee there is a lot of difficulties in really reforming our system. And at the end, if we don't get what we want, then it falls upon us as individual faculty members to defend ourselves. Of course, we should try our best to reform our system. But at the end, I think if we individual teachers are not courageous enough, we don't have integrity, then even though we have a reasonable system, people may still make mistakes, and people may still be able to get away from the mistakes they make. So, my final point is that, if our colleagues are timid and apathetic about, academic freedom, or about, protecting our own rights, or about, pushing our reform, then we really have not much hope for ourselves. So let's work together and put our strengths together. And given, our collective effort, then we will have more courage, we are more able to push our reform in the right direction.
Thank you, Joseph. There are no timid colleagues in here today. Just before opening up, I'll just say, the idea of negotiated reforms is a great idea, and it's an idea I'm very much in favor of negotiation, discussion, and communication. I think the big challenge that we have, though, in the current context is that the university, the council has a chairman, and the university has a chancellor. Neither of whom seem to be particularly addicted in terms of negotiation. But that's something that we'll be planning our heads against for a while. In any case, let's open up for comments, questions. Anybody wants to? Peter.
That was a wonderful presentation from both speakers, and I just want to say three things very quickly. First thing, from a historical perspective, government exercise control through its appointees and the structure of the council.
Can you use the microphone? I don't.
Oh, sorry. We're returning to the original function of the council and the use of members appointed by the chancellor. So it's interesting because by the time of Governor Wilson, he was not exerting any of his authority as chancellor of the university. He was agreeing with all the proposals that were made by the university in terms of appointment, graduation days, everything. So there was no political influence by the time of Governor Wilson. So we're actually returning to where we were in an earlier...
To the real colonial era.
To the real colonial era. The second thing I'd like to say is about the restructuring of the council, where the balance of membership was changed. There was a very good reason for that, and there were always more non-university people in the council than university people. But the non-university people didn't turn up to meetings.
Right.
So university people always had a majority
Right.
at those actual meetings. So that's the reason why the composition was changed, so that you can ensure that the university members would be voting for their own interests. So there was this conflict of
Yeah, I can
interest
see that.
even within the council at that time. The third point I'd like to make is with regard to Royal Children there and academic freedom. While it's correct to say that perhaps there wasn't the sort of reaction within the university that you would expect in terms of clarifying academic freedom and pathways towards academic freedom, you will remember that the Senate
Yes.
instituted a
Task
discussion
force,
and
yeah.
a task force on academic freedom, which many of us were interested in, many of us gave evidence to. But what's interesting in this latest set of events is that the Senate seems to have been emasculated. There hasn't been a call, as far as I'm aware, in the Senate for a similar revision of academic freedom and how academic freedom can be assured. So the question I would ask, I mean, we focus on council, chief executive, chancellor the whole time in terms of academic freedom. But what's the role now of the Senate, which traditionally has been the body within the university,
Right.
which is there to assure and to uphold that academic freedom?
I may not be able to respond to everything. I think you probably know more what's happening now, but you're right. I did, due to shortness of time, skip over that. In the book, we do talk about how the Senate task force did develop a policy on academic freedom. It is still on your website. You can find it under policies. But the Senate task force also recommended that there be a clear mechanism, a process where someone could bring a complaint if they felt that their academic freedom had been interfered with. And to my knowledge, if that process is there, it's not on the website. I don't know, and I've interviewed a number of academics and asked them, do you know what you would do if you've been, I don't know. So I think that is one of the problems. That task force report was, in my view, only partly implemented. But what I meant when I said the march towards centralization is that I still feel that the centralization of power worked against what the Senate task force was recommending. You might want to say more about what the Senate is doing now.
I have no idea. I'm not a member of Senate, but I remember during the controversies over Joanna's Chen, Senate did make one very sort of politically uncontroversial statement that they would defend academic freedom. They take academic freedom very seriously. But other than that, the Senate has not spoken on the latest issue.
I mean, the one ironic thing about the whole Johannes Chen's saga is that if his appointment had been confirmed, it seems to me it would have worked much better for the government, because Johannes would have been so busy being a pro-vice chancellor and a lot of his political activities he would have simply had to suspend. And I mean, he's acknowledged that to me when we spoke. And he would have, I think, probably, because Johannes is very conscious of rule of law and procedural restrictions, I think he would have immediately said, oh, I've got to stop this and this and this, because now I'm a pro-vice chancellor, and he would have been so busy. Instead, by going through this and punishing him for whatever he was perceived to have done to have encouraged Benny Tai, which I think is what this was all about, and I don't actually think he really played much of a role in Occupy Central at all, but because he's perceived as somehow someone who had to be punished for it, he's actually become so much more famous around the world, and a much, it's like the poster child now for academic freedom, which is a little bit ironic, but that's what I mean when I say I think sometimes the government's interests are not actually furthered by some of these activities. I think the government itself would have been much better off if they had just had much more of a hands-off approach. And I'm not really sure that it was the direction of the local government, but clearly it appears that a lot of pressure was being put on some members of council. Where it was coming from, I'm not entirely sure.
I just since there are so many people here from the law faculty, or someone who will just that. I mean, it seemed to me that it wasn't so much Johannes Chan was being punished as a proxy for any time, but the law faculty was being punished.
Potentially.
Because there's a lot of people in the law faculty who say things publicly that
Oh, yes.
are a thorn in the side of the government.
Yes, that could be.
And what do the, Eric, what do you think? You come in here on crutches as if someone's been beating you up.
Someone attacking you, Eric.
The problem is that it's really difficult to identify just one single reason for the Johannes saga. They may be doing this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's very difficult for one to, but clearly one can see that there must be some interference. Okay? Otherwise, there's no reason that the council would take such an active role to scrutinize Johannes' appointment and not follow the recommendation of the search committee.
Well, and all the publication of all those articles, and the sheer number of the articles in the pro-communist press.
Of course, something that I have heard, and again I can't confirm, is that it seems that the wording thing is that really it's not so much to punish Johannes, but rather it's not up to campus staff that they really want to control law faculty and also Hong Kong U. So it's not so much on a particular person.
Could be, yeah.
Yes, and so the whole idea, of course, the rumors, no one can confirm is that the next step would be that make sure that our current president will not stay long in university, and then there will be another president of VC being appointed, and that would be. If that happens, sometimes you have with the current structure, there's not much you can resist, because the whole process of searching for the new president of VC basically will be controlled or affected by the council chairman and his appointees. And so sometimes even as the council member, if a particular name is put forward, there's no basis for me to object or to say anything, because apparently I've gone through this process. So I can see that the problem sometimes is that if government or those in power really want to do something under our existing structures, I can see that sometimes not much we can oppose.
That's why, I mean, I'm not sure if you caught the first part of my presentation, Eric, but that's why I'm trying to make the case for trying to show the government why the current situation and what happened with the Johannes Chan saga doesn't actually serve the government's interests. It creates this expectation that the government can somehow control students and control the law faculty that you know they can't, really. They may intimidate some individual academics, they may temper some activities, but for the most part, the universities are still going to be hotbeds of political activity, probably. That's the way universities work. What will happen, though, if the interference continues, is that the reputation of the universities internationally will go down, and there will be more turmoil, I think, on campus, and that's not good for anyone. So that's my point, that just trying to make the case to show government that it would be better for everyone to sort of ratchet down the tension and create a structure that is better for the university's functioning and also for the reputation of the university and other universities.
We have a bit of a queue. Max, do you want to get in?
Yeah,
Spacey.
I had questions Lots of questions, and some of them I can't really make very clear, but questions about the connection between some of the things we were saying at the beginning and the stuff on neutrality, right? Because you seem to say that, well, I guess not being neutral, but somehow appearing neutral, at least at some level.
Well, the
is important.
institution.
The institutional level. So yeah, I guess one question is how far does that descend, right? So, I mean, you certainly don't want to say, I take it, that as individuals, we should remain politically neutral.
No.
Right? So,
No.
right, so then there are various larger bodies, you know, above the individual, but not quite at the institutional level. So I'm chairperson of the department. If my department agrees, right, amongst itself, it wants to support more democracy in Hong Kong, should I avoid that in order to hope for these negotiated reforms? That is, should we avoid that? Should we avoid political activism at the departmental level? And if so, why? And then I guess also just the idea of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and these seem to me to be themselves political values, or at least I'd like to hear why. I'd like to hear why they're not themselves political values. So how is it that one can be neutral and nevertheless advocate for values like academic freedom and institutional autonomy? I mean, you know, one kind of example that occurs to me is that, you know, you could, I mean, there's a way in which in the USA, for example, it's very difficult to remain politically neutral about, for example, gender or race diversity on campus. Right? How are you supposed to do that, or should you remain neutral, or should you instead advocate for this? Is this the kind of going back on the principle of neutrality if you do so? So there's the cluster of related questions. Either or both of you are welcome to respond.
All right, it's messy. I know it's messy, and obviously there are general big picture values that you can't be neutral about. But what I'm trying to drill down to is things like there has to be an understanding that there can be different political views within your department, right? And that someone doesn't feel obligated by you to sign on to something because perhaps they feel somewhat differently. If you think back to the Article 23 controversy, Fu Haling and Simon Young and I edited a book on the Article 23 legislation. Not everybody who contributed chapters had exactly the same view. I mean, Albert Chen had a slightly different view in his chapter than I had in my chapter, but we all agreed on certain general values. And the Center for Comparative and Public Law, when I was director, we put in plenty of submissions on law reform. But we didn't try to say or convey the view that this was the University of Hong Kong and everyone in the University of Hong Kong necessarily supports this particular bit of law reform. I know it's tricky territory to navigate, and it's particularly tricky if your specialty is an area of law or politics or government. It makes it harder. But I do think that one has to at least give some conscious thought to it. I mean, for example, in my law school right now, there's one person who's an avid opponent of the rail project in Hawaii. And he's actually sued the government to stop the rail. He's part of an NGO that is sued. There are other people in the law faculty who believe that the rail project is the best thing for the environment and getting rid of car pollution in Hawaii. And so, but there is an understanding that when he advocates for that, he doesn't try to give the impression that this is the law school's position on that politically sensitive issue. So I just think that academics do have an obligation to respect the diversity of views that you may have, and it may be supporting different political parties, supporting different proposals for political reform. There are lots of different ways to get to a more democratic system in Hong Kong. Some people felt going to the streets for civic nomination was the best. Other people felt that maybe a more middle-of-the-road proposal was better. I don't think any one of us can say that either one is inconsistent with the value of democracy. One might argue that the moderates could have made more progress. So that's just my point, is just to be sensitive to the fact that when one advocates for something, one does have to at least give some conscious thought. Am I wearing my university hat right now? Am I wearing my personal hat? Am I wearing my hat as an expert on this particular area? And not disregard the fact that there is an institutional interest, I believe, in allowing that diversity of views. I know that's maybe not a perfect answer, but that's what I'm trying to get people to think about.
Sort of following up on this question here, I appreciated your thinking about the global connections around academic freedom, and as somebody who in another life studied history of higher education, university was never one thing, right? It has been changing over, I mean, in the US it was a training ground for ministers in its early days. So in your work and in your reading and others who've thought about this, are we in a process of, I mean, not just a debate about academic freedom linked to democracy, but the changing university scene in light of globalization, the corporatization of universities, and even within one institution. I read a couple weeks ago in the South China Morning Post that the reason there's never been a woman vice chancellor in Hong Kong is because there, of course this would be a scientist, and women coming from sciences, there just haven't been that many. And I thought, wow, so even in Hong Kong U, we don't really know what the university is. So I just wonder, is there global theorizing about this going on?
Yes.
There is. I mean, there's a lot of literature. In fact, the first chapter of this book, we try to review the concept of university autonomy and academic freedom and how it's changed through globalization and increasingly competitive world. And I don't want to take up a lot of time with it, but there's no question that threats to academic freedom are coming at least as much from corporate influence over research, over grants, funding, donations, at least as much as from governments, right? And perhaps more so, I would say. And even groups that would like to think that they are immune to this are not. I mean, one of the concerns I have, and I have articulated at some of the events I've been speaking at in the US, is, you know, there are a lot of universities in the United States that want to have joint programs with the People's Republic of China with their universities, and they don't want to offend them. And we just saw this week with the American Bar Association, where they canceled a contract of Tang Biao. He was going to write a book. He had been commissioned by the American Bar Association to write a book about his experience as a human rights lawyer for China, and someone sent him an email saying, we're sorry, we have to retract the contract because some people in the American Bar Association are afraid it will impair our rule of law work in China, right? And I mean, a lot of lawyers are really upset about this because I don't think the American Bar Association's rule of law work in China has done much good. But they should not have commissioned this man to write a book and then later said, no, we're not going to publish your book because we're afraid it's going to hurt our essentially commercial interests. It's really what it means. So that kind of thing is happening all over, and I don't have a quick answer for you other than it's something to be vigilant about. And it does offer, I think, some comparative models around the world because people are trying to give some real conscious thought to how do we create institutions to defend against this, how to strengthen it.
Brendan.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Petersen. I mean, this is very enlightening, and colleagues in the room have been here for decades. So the historical context is really valuable, and I also think it's important to discuss some of the current issues that surround us, but I'm concerned we're getting involved in the minutiae here of who said what and who's dealing with this. I think we really need a much stronger focus. I wonder if you agree. There are 3 points I'd like to make, and I'd like to get your perspective on them. The first one is something I have discussed within the vigilance group with colleagues about the necessity for an ombud in the university. That is something we see in both corporations and university structures in the United States, not in Europe, but definitely in the US, not in Australia incidentally either. But it is something that I do think we could pursue effectively at the level of governance reform.
Yes.
The second one, which I think is interesting, is to do with the notion of a titular head. What does that mean in the context of Hong Kong? I think we could look to former shall we say, Commonwealth countries, not necessarily colonial countries, let's say Singapore and Australia. Singapore, the situation is the president of Singapore is the head of NUS. I don't know about the other universities, but there's quite clearly a similarity there with Hong Kong. In Australia, though, the president of the University of Melbourne, for example, it does vary across institutions in Australia, is linked to the state legislature and is invited to become the president and then also the chair of the council of the University of Melbourne. And this is a process that has gone on since 1850. This is an interesting possibility, I think, in the current context, in that I think it would appeal to the vanity of our current council chair to, in fact, be somebody who was both the chancellor and also the chair of the council. Of course, it's a direction that none of us would want to go in the current context of the personality involved, but at the level of power and trying to usurp power from individuals' vested interests, I think we do have to play into the hands of those interests and to make it attractive at some level to make real change. And the third point, I think, is about the media attention that we currently see at the University of Hong Kong in all of these issues, where I think it's an issue for debate, but I'm concerned or interested in knowing how things are handled in the United States, with which I'm completely unfamiliar. But certainly in the UK and Australia, it would be very exceptional for any member of a council of the university, president or vice chancellor, to address the media on any issue to do with the governance of the university, whereas here what we're seeing is quite a clear courting of media. And I think we can also use that, if you like, live by the sword and die by the sword. And I do think eventually the use of the media by the current incumbent will be something that will be difficult for that person to manage. However, I do think we need to have some kind of a model about how we might use governance at the university level to try to modify or moderate or monitor the level of media engagement that we see with the university governance and the media itself. This, I think, is a legal issue and one to do with freedom of speech. In other words, where do we prevent or stop, or what mores, cultural values, do we wish to impose or to try to encourage, where we refrain, where the university governance refrains from engaging with the media? Do we think that's an important thing or not an important thing to do? Is it appropriate to engage the media? How much can we use the media in the context of this debate?
I'm going to take the first two questions first, and then I'm going to ask you a question about the third one, because I'm not sure I understand it. Having an ombuds, I think, is a fabulous idea, and it's actually something I've written about elsewhere, that this is one mechanism. That's what I meant when I said there's no mechanism. The Senate task force said we should have a mechanism. Our university of Hawaii used to have an ombuds, and I think it worked quite well. Basically, it's someone you can go to for complaints, not just academic freedom, but other issues. And they abolished it during the 2009 financial crisis. And it's been a real disaster, because now people come to the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, just when I head up, and I keep having to say, we're not actually a service unit, we're an academic department. It's kind of like
The ombud was an internal member of the Hawaii.
the ombud was someone had actually been seconded. He was an expert in mediation who had been seconded from the political science department, Neil Miller, and he was the ombuds. And he had a staff of 2 other mediators and investigators who worked with him. And I think it was a very effective conflict resolution mechanism. But the chancellor at the time decided...
It wasn't just for academic freedom.
No, it was for complaints generally. And a lot of universities have ombuds, and I think it's a really great idea. The titular head idea, and what you were talking about with other models, I honestly think, I know there are all these traditions of this. I think it's just a bad idea, and we should move away from it, because the problem is having a ceremonial head that's hitched to government in any form, whether it's the legislature or the executive branch. It only works if there's this very strict adherence to constitutional convention and of not really using the power, except maybe in very, very rare situations. And I just think in the political scenario of Hong Kong, I just think one should be trying to move away from that. And I think because this Newby report actually criticizes it, I think you've got some, I don't want to say ammunition because I'm trying to promote conflict resolution, but you have some support for arguing, you know, this is just not a good situation to have the universities feeling that we have to please the chief executive because he is our chancellor. It's just not a good situation. It's not good for the academic reputation of the universities. Your third question about the media, I confess I'm not exactly clear what you mean when you say, who is we? I mean, what we are you talking about? Are we managing, are you talking about individual academics? Or are you talking about the chair of council?
Let me unpack a little bit. I see there's a direct contradiction and there's a tension between what we wish to protect, freedom of speech, i.e. complete openness in the media, and the use of the media by people within our university structure to engage in political change in a way that isn't necessarily beneficial to the university.
Okay.
So how do we manage that? Currently, it sometimes feels as if the people who are managing the news in our university are managing the university. For me, this is an absolutely core, critical issue at this university. And I believe it's reflected in a number of different ways. It's not just Hong Kong, it's all over the world. But the manipulation of media, the use of media, the use of the freedom of the press, which of course I will defend, needs to be monitored, checked, or at least considered in an intellectual forum. How is it that we can in fact do that as this group has gathered here today?
Well, I don't think there is any managing the media. And I mean, I agree with you that sometimes freedom of the press can be very detrimental. When you look at all the smear campaign, basically, of Johannes and some of the Chinese newspapers, if that's what you're referring to, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at, but as much as we may often not like the way the media is used, I don't know of any way to prevent that other than making your own case in the media. So, but maybe I'm not understanding the question.
I think that's a valid point. I guess my point is the current council chair is using the media,
Sure.
I mean, to his benefit. There's no way we can attempt to limit that.
That's
what
right.
we have to do as a group is figure out how to respond to that.
Yes,
how
that's
to
right.
actually take advantage of that possibility. Whether we do that actively or passively is something I think we really need to discuss. It just doesn't happen in the UK or Australia. It just doesn't happen. It happens in those countries when you're trying to raise funds, but it doesn't happen when you're dealing with governance, core values of a university system, because those are not currently debated. They are in Hong Kong. Are they in US, in Hawaii? I think CUNY, for example, is undergoing a similar kind of issue right now. So do we have models in the US where this is something that we could learn from?
I don't think you'd want to copy the US in that regard. I mean, I know of lots of other examples where battles at university campuses have been fought out in the press with proxies and different views, and I can't say that we have any way of avoiding the problems. But my answer to your smaller question